A Pentagon nominee stirs lots of controversy, and a new fiscal cliff stirs lots of worries. Welcome to Seib and Wessel on WSJ.com. I'm Jerry Seib. This week, a lot of the conversation around town has been about the president's pick to run the Pentagon. Chuck Hagel, a former Republican senator from Nebraska, who's aroused a lot of opposition from, ironically, Republicans. And here to talk about that is a Democratic senator, Jack Reed from Rhode Island, West Point graduate, veteran, and member of the Armed Services Committee, and Hagel fan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Jerry. Thanks for
So let me start with a basic question. Why do you want Chuck Hagel to be Secretary of Defense?
Well, Chuck has some extraordinarily, in some cases, unique talents. He would be the first enlisted soldier ever to serve as Secretary of Defense. He's the first Secretary of Defense since Elliot Richardson to be awarded the Purple Heart. He's served in combat. He understands, not just intellectually, but in his gut, what these young men and women in our uniform of the United States are facing every day. So he brings that quality, which is unique, and I think very important. Second, he's been a student of foreign affairs as a United States Senator, as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, head of the Atlantic Council. This is someone who has been well tutored in the critical issues that are facing the United States and national security. He's been a successful business person. He's been also, in his younger days, the second in charge of the Veterans Administration. So you have someone who's committed to the welfare of our troops and their families, who understands, not just intellectually, but from his own experience, what it's like to fight the wars of the United States. He understands the great policy issues. And I think another factor which is important too is that he has the trust and confidence of the President and will carry out the President's orders as Commander-in-Chief, but he'll do so by ensuring that the President gets the hard questions, the hard information, so he can make the best decision.
You know, if you were to summarize the case against Chuck Hagel, I guess you would probably say it's that he's too hard on Israel and too soft on Iran. What's your response to those two lines of argument?
Chuck has been a strong supporter of Israel, supported in his tenure $38 billion of aid, has been a frequent visitor to Israel, has received the endorsement of several former American ambassadors to Israel that understand Israel better than I do and also understand the importance, as I respect, of our relationship to Israel. So I think those arguments are way off base.
But he's also made a point of saying the U.S. has to make its own foreign policy decisions, not be pulled by Israel, which kind of has implied that that's what happens sometimes.
Well, you know, I would hope that the Prime Minister and the Defense Minister of Israel would make the same point with respect to Israel, that ultimately the sovereignty and the security of the State of Israel is their most important issue. So for a United States Defense Secretary or a candidate to say that ultimately the interest of the United States seems to be not only appropriate, but exactly what the message should come out of Tel Aviv.
And on Iran, he has raised questions over the years about the effectiveness of sanctions on Iran, which has become the cornerstone of this administration's policy toward Iran. Can those two things be reconciled?
I think they can, because I think a lot of Chuck's sort of questioning has been about unilateral sanctions, which under the Bush administration were imposed but were not as effective. I think the key difference under President Obama and a huge, in fact, I think improvement has been this multilateral approach. Frankly, if you said 2 or 3 years ago that the Europeans would basically stop taking gasoline and petroleum products from Iran, I'd say that's never going to happen, particularly given the financial crisis they face. It is happening. Those multilateral sanctions are having a real effect in Iran. And I think Chuck would be, his point was that, you know, if we're going to have sanctions, they've got to be across the board, they've got to be every nation, they've got to really put pressure on. And I think what we're seeing is that approach taking effect.
You know, the other thing that has created some consternation among Republicans is the way then Senator Hagel essentially turned on the Iraq War, voted to authorize the operation initially, very soon afterwards decided it was a mistake. Is that at the heart of a lot of this, a difference of opinion about the worth of 10 years of war in Iraq?
I think that's a part of it, but if I recall Chuck's floor speech, and it raised very serious questions, some of them prophetic, about do we have the capacity.
You mean right at the outset?
At the outset.
Yeah.
This was not someone who was, sort of, let's go, this is going to be easy. He voted for it. I voted against it. I thought that this was not the best policy for the United States. We still had an unfinished mission in Afghanistan. There is not the predicate of a sufficient sort of evidence of a nuclear capacity, etc., and that we still had other tools. But Chuck was very, very clear in his discussion at that time about the challenges ahead. And when some of these questions he raised materialize, our lack of a plan really for the occupation of Iraq, our under-resourcing, our inability to engage effectively, decisions that were made by the administration to essentially discharge the entire Iraqi army, creating hundreds of thousands of armed and annoyed Iraqis. He, to his credit, raised these questions at an increasing level. And I think that's to me not a disqualifier. That's a qual. That means that he will, in this case, in the context of his consultations with the president, not on the floor of the Senate, raise concerns if he feels that President Obama is not asking the right questions or getting the right information or making the right judgments. And Chuck's the type of guy who has the integrity to, carry out effectively the policy of the United States, or if that's not possible, then he will, leave the scene.
Does the vehemence and the breadth of the opposition on the Republican side surprise you, and can you predict that you'll overcome that and this confirmation will happen?
I believe Chuck will be confirmed. He brings, again, this very powerful array of talents, experience. I think he has to make the case for himself. I've been through a number of Senate nominations in different capacities, not just on the national security side, but in the whole spectrum. And it's ultimately the nominee that has to make the case individually, in many cases, senators, about where he's coming from, what his vision is, etc. So this is going to be something that I'm confident Chuck can and will do. The vehemence, the surprise is discounted a bit by the vehemence seemingly about almost every issue, unfortunately. It is a different Senate from the one I joined in 1997, where there seemed to be a broader bipartisan base, particularly in national security issues. You could disagree, but you didn't have to do it in a disagreeable way. So a bit surprised, but again, in this context of polarization, everything seems to be sort of a zero-sum game.
Let me just ask you this finally, leaving Chuck Hagel aside for a second. You've been in and around the defense establishment for your whole adult life. You're on the Armed Services Committee. Regardless of who's the defense secretary right now, what are the challenges, what are the missions, what are the problems that are going to be at the top of the list for the next defense secretary?
First of all, there's the fiscal pressure that every department will feel. DOD won't be exempt because we have to get our fiscal house in order. Second, we have the need to effectively retrograde our forces out of Afghanistan. I just returned there about 24 hours ago. We're making progress on the ground, but the key factors remain governance, an effective election next year for the next president of Afghanistan, a regional reconciliation, effective support, or at least not disruption by some of the regional neighbors. Those are challenges that the next Secretary of Defense will face. And then there's a third major challenge, which is challenging the entire government, a whole new dimension of warfare, cyber warfare. And this is going to be the most important sort of development in terms of defense policy since, I think, the introduction of the airplane in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. That we have to be prepared for that. And it's not just the Defense Department, it's Homeland Security. It's even our banking agencies, because there's evidence accumulating that some of the Iranians are trying to disrupt banking processes. So that's an issue for the whole government, but DOD will have a critical role. And then there's always the issue, which is for the Secretary of Defense to effectively communicate, effectively lead the men and women of the armed forces. And here's again where I think Chuck Hagel has a special talent. He not only speaks their language, they understand he's literally walked in their boots. He's led a squad in combat. He knows how tough it is. He knows it's not a science. It's not theoretical. It's not, you know, geopolitical forces. Ultimately, it's brave young men and women in the uniform of the United States taking great risks for their country. That bond, both explicit and implicit, I think is going to be a powerful tool that he will be able to use to make tough decisions.
Yeah. Well, Senator Reid, you're kind of joining us to talk about it today, fresh off the plane from Afghanistan. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Jerry.